I want to talk briefly about astrology and the attraction that some people have to it. Generally, people seem to believe that astrology shows us that there is some kind of external influence over people that can reveal something about their character, and that this overrides everything because it's a sort of cosmic, universal concept. So if somebody is a Leo, then all Leos are pretty much the same, because people always say to you, "Oh, when's your birthday?" "Oh, okay, well then you're an Aquarius." "Oh, right, so okay, I know lots of Aquariuses. I know you're all roughly the same. The way you all behave is going to be all the same," until you press them on that point, and then they start sort of subdividing the details into smaller and smaller details, and each of these become more important than the original detail. So they'll say, "Oh no, it depends when your moon, where the moon is at the time, or it depends where Mercury was at the time," or so these details become smaller and smaller and smaller until the original point that you was a Pisces or a Cancer is actually the least important point, and all these other tiny points are more important, which sort of destroys their original argument in my mind. Also, that they rely on a form of astrology that is relatively recent. I believe that Western astrology comes from Babylonian astrology via the Greeks. And there are older forms of astrology out there that, if we're to consider that older, with ancient wisdom, it's the older texts that are more important than the newer texts, or the older sources are more important than the more modern sources, then surely the older forms of astrology would be more important than the newer forms. And the Chinese astrology is more ancient than Western astrology, so if you really believe in astrology, you should probably defer to the Chinese version of astrology. But then that leads to you having to admit that race is somehow more important than your astrological star sign, because the Chinese astrology applies to Chinese people, and for you to then tell them that they have to accept the European form of astrology, even though their astrology is older, you get into a very awkward conversation with those Chinese people, trying to convince them that something more modern and European is in fact a better form of ancient wisdom than their more ancient indigenous form. So with that in mind, you have to, the believer in astrology has to now acknowledge that race is more important than astrology, which diminishes astrology to something less than your racial group. And how many astrologers would argue that men and women are exactly the same? probably a ridiculous astrologer would argue that men and women are the same, and that they don't take into consideration things like menstruation, which is quite clearly controlled by the moon. So we then have the differences of gender being more important than astrology. So if you're a Leo male or a Leo female, being a male or a female is more important than being a Leo or a Pisces or whatever you are. And we've already concluded that being Chinese or being European or being South American is more important than being a Leo or a Pisces or Cancer. So we have your gender is more important, and now your race is more important. So we've sort of seen in this conversation astrology being diminished to being something that's fairly arbitrary beyond those 2 points. And anybody who has a reasonable mind would have to conclude that this is the only acceptable way of looking at it, and that any influence that the planets hold over you is fairly minimal beyond those two things. So we can see that there are racial differences between people, and that these are fairly well fixed and accepted, and we can see that there are gender differences between men and women, and that these are also fairly fixed and well accepted. So if you want to carry on believing in astrology, feel free, but those two massive influences, which are just both there on a genetic level, obviously play a bigger part in who we are than where some planets were at the time of our birth. So I'm not trying to take it away from anybody if they want to believe in it, but I think that in order for us to move on and evolve a little bit, we might have to give up a few old ways of seeing things in order to clarify our vision a little bit more, so that we can approach the world in a much more reasonable way and a less superstitious way. There is one thing I think astrology is actually beneficial for, and that is for preserving stories and probably the preservation of ancient wisdom. So paper doesn't last very long. Paper you won't find paper from 1,000 years ago. You'll find parchment from 1,000 years ago written on animal skins or written on papyrus grass or something. And previous to that, you'll find instruction or ancient wisdom written on stone, because it's a lot more long lasting. But I think the longest lasting medium in the world has been the stars. And so within the stars, there are stories that have been preserved through the zodiac and astrological mythologies. And these are probably much more important than the sort of Libra, Aquarius type stuff. And that is that there are 12, things like there are 12 months in the year, and those 12 houses that the earth goes through, or the sky rotates around those 12 houses, and that gives us a year. And it's a pretty good marker for a year. It's probably out by a few hours or something. But still, it is, if this was some sort of ancient wisdom discovered 30,000 years ago, that the Earth rotates around and that there are 360 degrees in this rotation, and that 360 divides into 12, and the 1 foot is 12 inches, and there's 24,000 miles around the Earth, which is 2 times 12, and there's 24 hours in the day, which is 2 times 12, and so on and so forth. And so all of these calculations, which were at one point ancient wisdom, there was something that needed to be recorded somehow and passed on in order to further civilization and to further man's progress, and that the best place to probably record this data and preserve this ancient wisdom was in the stars, which is the most the most long-lasting medium on which you could preserve anything. And so I do believe that astrology holds some importance, but I think that maybe the emphasis has been placed on the wrong elements of it.